Now that we have our input values provided in state, how do we take those state values and supply them to our register mutation when our user clicks on the register button when they submit the form? Let's take a look at our render props function. This create user function. So we can grab create user and we can execute it where we need. So we can execute it within our JSX, or we can do it above our return. Now note that we still can destructure some values from the parameters. We just have to add a comma after the function for the mutation, and then we can grab the loading and error values. So we'll come back to these values later. For now, we want to execute this create user mutation when our form's submitted. So for that, we can add an onSubmit handler directly on our opening form tag. And then once again, we can use an inline arrow function, and we'll pass create user to a new function that we'll create called handle submit. We write an inline arrow function because if we didn't, handle submit would be executed when our component mounts. To make sure it's only done when the user submits the form, we make this an inline function, and then we can pass through create user. Now, just like for our onChange events, we will need to supply the event itself that's returned from a submit event, and we'll see why in just a second. So in the parameters of this inline arrow function, we want to get event and pass it through to handle submit either as the first or second argument. Now let's go above our return and create handle submit. So we'll say const handle submit. Remember, since this isn't a class-based component, we need to initialize this or declare this function with const. And then within the parameters, we get access to event and create user. When our form's submitted, we don't want the page to refresh. We don't want to cause a full pushback to the server. So we need to prevent the default action when a form's submitted, and we do that by taking the event and calling on it prevent default. Next, we can execute our create user function, and there are two ways of passing our state values to create user to our mutation. We're going to use both patterns throughout this course. The first is to directly pass them to our mutation function, and we do so within an object that accepts a variables property, and then variables itself is an object upon which we need to supply for each of our arguments the name of the argument, in this case username, and its value, which we also get from username, as well as an email argument set to email and a password argument set to password. If this is the case, if the property name and value are the same, we can use the ES6 shorthand syntax and just reduce all of this to username, email, and password. We won't use this particular approach at the moment. Instead, we can directly provide our variables on our opening mutation tag by adding this variables prop, which again is an object. So we need two sets of curly braces here. And again, we can use our ES6 shorthand syntax by providing username argument and its value, and the same for email and password. Again, as I mentioned, we can execute the create user mutation just like this. This is perfectly valid, but we won't get a return value here. If you're passing your mutation function to another function above the return, it's worth noting that this function returns a promise, so that if you use the async await syntax for handling promises, for resolving promises, you can easily get the value that's returned from this mutation put in a variable. And from there you can do whatever you want with that value. So we're going to make handle submit an async await function. We do that by prefixing the parameters with async, and then we will await create user, and we'll put the return value from create user in a variable called res, and for now we're just going to console log res. We're going to add some additional stuff to this component, but for now we just want to test this out. So let's save register.js, and we'll add a new user. We'll open our console. So I'll provide the username Jane at yahoo.com, the password of Jane, and hit register, and the page doesn't reload, and we see in the console a response and on it a data object, and within it a create user object, again following our exact pattern, the exact JSON response that was returned to us in graphical, and on user we get the created username and email.